Well, it's good to be here this morning with you. And since it is kind of baseball season, I guess Jeb said that this is the last in the series of the book of James. So since Jeb, I guess, has been kind of the main pitcher throughout the series, I guess you could call me the closer. So, sounds like I've already struck out. So anyway, I'm glad to have an opportunity to be here and to talk about the book of James. And I was thinking this week about good news and bad news. Are you the type of person that likes to hear the good news or the bad news first? You know, if you're like me, I usually like to, well, tell me the bad news, and then that way I can hear the good news. So that reminded me of a story about a man and his wife that they go to the doctor. Now, I don't know about you gentlemen that are married. My wife likes to go to the doctor with me when I have an appointment, which sometimes it used to kind of bother me. But, you know, now, because whenever I go to the doctor and I don't bring her, she will ask me, well, did you ask the doctor this? Well, I didn't think of that. Did you ask the doctor that? I said, I didn't think about that either. So when she comes with me, and then it's her responsibility to ask the doctor this and that. So anyway, the story goes, this man and his wife, she dutifully goes with him to the doctor's appointment. So anyway, they get a battery of tests done on her husband, and so the doctor afterwards says, I need to speak to your wife. So the wife comes in, he goes, I've got some good news and bad news. What would you like to hear first? Well, she says, well, tell me the bad news. Because the bad news is the tests that we've run on your husband, we've found that he has a disorder that can be fatal. She goes, oh, that's terrible. He goes, but because there's good news. Because this disorder that he has, that there is kind of a cure to it. He says, and the cure to it is that every day you must feed him breakfast in bed. You must allow him to eat whatever he wants, to allow him to watch the football games he wants, and to have no stress in his life. You need to do those things, and he can be cured. The wife goes, thank you. So the wife and the husband, they get in the car, they're driving home. The husband, he's a little nervous about this. He says, I didn't find out what was going on. He says to his wife, he goes, well, what did the doctor say? And she kind of looks at him with a sad face. She goes, honey, I'm sorry, but you're going to die. Anyway. The thing I like about the book of James is he's very practical in his applications. And certainly this morning's lesson is, I would say, it's very practical too. That I called this lesson about faith in action. And certainly I think that's what God wants us to have, is a faith that is active in our lives. It is a faith that, not simply that we believe in God about, but yet it is a faith that we demonstrate. And so this morning I'm going to try to get through this. I brought myself some water up here. If you would have spoken to me 2 weeks ago, I didn't even have a voice, for those of you that tried speaking to me. So I'm almost over that, but I do have some lubrication here for my voice. So James is a book about action. And sometimes the action that he talks about, I don't always like the action. I know earlier Jeb talked about if you fall into various trials and tribulations, what does James say about that? Is to count it all joy. And I think I don't like falling into trials and tribulations. And how do I count it as joy? And sometimes we ask God, do something significant in my life. And then when God does do something significant, because sometimes doing something significant means we're going to have some problems, some difficulties, some challenges in our life. And we say, God, that's not what I meant when I said do something significant. I just want good things, not the challenges. So I think the thing to realize, the thing about in our life, that our life as our faith should be demonstrated by action in our life. It should be one that should be alive in our faith. Just as Abraham, he talks about Abraham, gives Abraham the example here of offering his son. That is his faith, that Abraham recognized that God had a plan, that God had a direction, therefore that he was active in his faith and willingly to offer his son. And he did that. Have you ever broken a bone? Those of you that have broken a bone, I've had a few in my life. I broke a finger one time, didn't have to have a cast for that. Broke some ribs, no cast for that. Broke a leg, got a cast for that. But if you have ever worn a cast, what happens to those muscles in your leg or your arm or whatever had the cast after a while? Kind of atrophies, it shrinks, it gets smaller, gets weaker. When they eventually take that cast off, your arm is, arm's not as big as it used to be, not the massive muscles that I had. And I think the same is true when we talk about the faith in our lives. That if we do not exercise our faith, that we can, in fact, lose some of that faith. So, something that we need to think about as we try to be active of our faith in life. And this morning, I guess, of course, you'll notice here that there is no PowerPoint. So I'm sorry, no PowerPoint. No, Jeb's good about having PowerPoints, and I didn't get his permission to talk about PowerPoints. I know Jeb, whenever he talks about something, he always asks permission. But anyway, I like giving Jeb a hard time sometimes about his PowerPoints, because sometimes he has points 1, 2, and 3, and just like you folks out there, when you get to point number 3, you think, all right, it's almost over and I can go something. But then I find out that point number 3, it's just a sub-point for 6 more points. So I'm going to keep you guys just going to be in mystery today because you don't know what the last point is. So, but I do see there's a clock back there so I can watch that. So, James talks about having an active and living faith, and that we have many opportunities in our life to demonstrate that faith. Just as he talks about here, if someone comes to us and says, I'm in need of food or of help, or I'm hungry, and all we do is tell them, well, go, be warm, be fed, and peace be to you. And really, have we done anything for that person? Have we really engaged? Have we activated our faith? And I think that's what we need to do. And I think sometimes if there is somebody in need or something, so oftentimes the question we ask or we can ask, and I think here in Kitsap County we see it a lot. And if you go over to Seattle, I was actually in Seattle yesterday, walking back to the ferry. It's not unusual to see people on the side of the sidewalks asking for money, requesting money, and we see it here in our own community. And I think sometimes what goes through our head is that person really deserving of being helped? Has this person squandered the opportunities that God has given them in their lives to do that? So I guess I'm saying sometimes we can make justification why we are not going to help or not going to do things. And so I think that's probably something that each and every one of us need to think about in our life, that it's not necessarily those that are deserving. And I guess the question also is the things that we have, whose really are they? Are they really ours? I think we think that God has made us a steward of what we have, and we have certain responsibilities of what we do with the things that we have. So, we see that Abraham, he offered his son in obedience. And I like to also think about Abraham and his life, that when he the Bible first talks about Abraham, he was kind of in his homeland of, I think it was called Haran. And God asked Abraham, he said, Abraham, I want you to get up and leave Haran and go to a place that you have never been before. And he says, I'm going to bless you. And Abraham, I think in his life, when we think of someone live a life of action and faith, he could have said, God, I'm comfortable here in my home of Haran. I mean, I've got my friends here. I know these people. I'm familiar in this place. Why do you want me to go someplace else? Why don't you just bless me here? But yet God was calling him out into a life of doing something extraordinary. He left that familiar surroundings and went into a future that he didn't really know what existed. But yet because of his faith, he went about and followed God's direction. So I guess when we think about where we are at in our lives, are we really enabled to step out in action when God is calling us and directing us to move to someplace new or to do something new? Or yet, are we simply going to be comfortable where we're at? So again, James is saying that our belief is not simply demonstrated by my belief system, my belief in Jesus Christ, but in how we see that acted out in our lives. You know, I go back to a story of myself when I was a young man. I think I was maybe in 9th or 10th grade. And I used to always kind of glory a little bit in this story because I thought, wow, I really did something important. But my family, those of you that know me, I was originally, as a child, born in Biloxi, Mississippi. And kind of moved away from there, but always had some family still back there. And if you're familiar with Mississippi Golf Course, there's Biloxi and Gulfport right next to each other. Well, I had an uncle that he ran a small marina repair business in Gulfport, and he had his own sailboat. So we would go down there periodically and visit family. And one summer, he took a lot of the family out on his sailboat. And if you're familiar with the Mississippi Gulf Coast, there's a chain of islands out there. And one of the islands that we'd like to go to is called Ship Island. And out on Ship Island, there's like an old fort that you could go visit and stuff. So the family, we got on his sailboat, headed out towards Ship Island. Of course, since it was a sailboat, he couldn't bring it right up to shore. Had to kind of anchor it out 100 yards from the island. And so he had a little dinghy, so he was ferrying everybody back and forth. So it was myself and my oldest brother, you know, being the young, strong teenagers. We weren't going to wait to be ferried. We were going to swim into the island. So, and my uncle, for some reason, he had like one set of diving gear, one mask, one fin. So me and my brother decided, he said, I'm going to put the mask on, you put the fins on. We're going to swim in. Of course, I think he realized about halfway out that was a poor decision. Halfway out to the island, we're swimming along, and my brother taps me on the shoulder. He goes, I'm done. He goes, I can't swim any further. He says, you keep going. I just kind of looked at him and said, what do you mean you're done? What do you mean you're done? We're only halfway to the island's still halfway out. How can you be done? And he goes, here, you take the mask and you keep swimming. I said, what do you mean? He goes, I can't make it. I said, what do you mean you can't make it? I said, you got to make it. You're going to drown if you don't continue going. So I said, well, no. So I remember I tried taking the fins off and getting to him, but it's too much struggle. So I said, well, just try and grab a hold of me, and I'll see how far I can swim. Well, eventually, taking little bits and pieces, we eventually made it back into the island, both of us very tired. And then so I always think, boy, I saved my big brother's life. You know, it's always kind of, you know, having an older brother or sister, they always kind of rub things. That was kind of one thing I always had on him. And I used to always think, no, but then I stopped and thought about that. I says, now wait a second. He was willing to give what he had to me to try and make sure I saved my life. And all I was doing was just saving my life, but he was thinking about me. And I think in a life of action and service to others, that's what our lives are all about, serving others. Not simply just thinking about saving me and myself, but yet saving others. And I think that's what we talk about. A life of action and service to God is part of that, giving. So the question is, will we, in our own lives, will we do the extraordinary for God to serve and help, or will it simply be warm and fed and go in peace? A story I like to think about when God calls us or calls someone, and I think as we mentioned, Abraham leaving it all behind in Haran and going to this new place that he didn't know anything about. In 1 Kings, the 19th chapter, talks about Elijah and Elisha. Now, I always get those two guys, their names mixed up. I wish they could have been like two prophets with really different names, but they're Elisha and Elijah. And so as the story goes, Elijah had been the prophet, and God had told him it was time to basically find a replacement. And God led him to another man, Elijah. And when he came to Elijah, Elijah was basically out doing life. He was plowing in his field. It said he had 12 oxen, and that he was leading the oxen through the field. And what Elijah did is he came to Elisha and took his coat and put it around Elisha, which basically at that time they understood what that meant, that he was basically transferring his authority or his work to someone else, and that other person was Elisha. And Elisha, he understood what that meant. So Elisha says, before we do this, because he goes, I understand what's happening here. He says, I want to go back and see my family, tell them goodbye, kiss my mother goodbye before I go off with you. And Elijah's comment was, go, do whatever. That's your business. Basically, Elijah is saying, I'm coming to you because God called me to bring you to you. He says, what you do, it's up to you. You have to decide. So what does Elisha do? He has his 12 oxen and his plowing equipment. He goes back home and he decides to throw a big banquet for everyone in his community. He takes the very equipment that he used for plowing with to make a fire, and he sacrifices the 12 oxen. And so I think we could think, now wait a second, Elisha, if you're going to be following Elijah, being a prophet is not necessarily always a very reliable source of income. Maybe you should sell those oxen and sell that plowing equipment because it all has some value, and you can kind of have a plan B in case the prophet thing doesn't go very well. But that's not what Elisha did. Is he basically decided to completely put away that past and totally put his trust and faith in God, his action in God, and living that out. He set out and became the servant of Elijah and followed him. And I think sometimes when we finally really decide to follow Jesus and God, that there comes a point where some of our interests that we have to maybe give up. Some of those relationships that we have that maybe aren't good for us, we have to give up. Some of those things that we're engaged in, maybe we have to give up. We have to put them behind us and to follow God. So, did he know what his future held for him? Of course not. But he knew that God was calling him into a new future that he needed to follow into that new future. And he was thinking about what he could do as he sacrificed his past to create a new future, to follow God and being transformed and into that transformation. I think sometimes, when we think about the nature of God, we think that God is a God that is never changing. And I think really about the God that, yes, he is not changing, but yet in another kind of dichotomy, that God is the God of change. Because when he talks about us as his people, he talks about what? Transformation. And in order to have a transformation in my life, that I have to go through some change. And sometimes I have to put aside some of the things in my past in order to step out with God into the future. But I think sometimes that the action that we may engage in for God, that it may sometimes create some criticism. They say if you're sitting on the sideline, you're not doing anything, you can't be criticized about anything, can you? If I'm not doing anything, there's nothing to criticize me about. And I'm certainly not encouraging to be a critic, but I think that's the reality of things. If you're engaged in doing something for God, there may be some criticism that takes place. But yet we need to forge on even in spite of the criticism. And we need to think about how can I serve God? What things can I do to become active in my life, as James talks about, as being active in our faith? Sometimes that God can take, and you even look at his disciples, he can take men that in essence were just average, ordinary men, but yet he can take the average people and make them into something extraordinary. So I think sometimes I think about God, that God is not the God of being average when it comes to serving him. That he wants us to accomplish extraordinary things. And oftentimes he has a purpose and a future for us, but yet we have to allow him, his Spirit in our lives, to be able to take on that new future that he has for us. Oftentimes stories of biblical heroes are not always what we expect. When I think about Abraham, I can think of Abraham being a biblical hero, leaving Haran and going to this new country, not really knowing where he's going. But do you ever think about some of the people that God has used as being a biblical hero? James here, he also mentions Rahab. What was Rahab's, what did she do? She says she was a prostitute. But yet God via her faith in him, also was able to use her in a very positive way. So God, no matter what our past is, that God still desires to use us in a positive way in his kingdom, to step out in faith and in activity for him. You know, I think in our own country, sometimes we think about the history of the United States. One of the big events was 9/11. And for many people, I think it just kind of, after 9/11, it kind of paralyzed them. And at that time, I remember I actually went to my, date myself a little bit, but that's okay. Well, I was going to my 25th high school reunion, which was literally like 2 weeks after 9/11 happened. And if you remember during that time, that they weren't flying any airplanes for a while. And I think, I didn't even know whether I was going to be able to go. We'd already bought tickets, Linda and I. And it was still kind of planned, you know, if they started up the planes again, we were going to go. But I can remember, yes, they started up, you know, flying again. So I can remember being on that airplane as we flew into, we had a stop in Chicago. And I've flown into Chicago many times. So I kind of was a little bit familiar with the flight path. So, you know, you're thinking 9/11, they kind of veered from the flight path. So I remember I was kind of really paying attention to where was the plane heading. And a few times I thought as we got close to the city, I was thinking, you know, the airport's that direction. Why are we going this direction? And you kind of become paralyzed with a little bit of fear. And I think sometimes in our lives that because of the past things that maybe have happened to us, you know, we're season of Halloween, the things that have haunted us in their past, that it paralyzes us from moving on into the future that God has for us. And I think that we need to not be paralyzed and stopped by bad relationships that we've had in the past. You ever heard of somebody that says, well, I had this person betrayed me, or I had a bad relationship in the past, and therefore I'm not going to give my heart or my life to anyone again. But yet God wants us to put those things behind us and to move forward into the future, into a life of activity for him. I was recently kind of listening to, I guess, a TED Talk. Anybody know what the TED Talks are? Okay, so I forget, it's actually an acronym, stands for, I think, technology, education, and something. I probably got the acronym wrong. But anyway, it's about different experts throughout the world that they give them a chance to speak about their expertise. And I think here recently, kind of like the Nobel Prize, whoever they decide gave the most interesting or the best talk or whatever, they have a prize that goes with it. So they had one gentleman that he was a businessman from India. And in his talk, he talked about the different philosophies between the Eastern and Western philosophy. He says, now the Eastern philosophy, because if you're familiar with India and Hinduism, they believe in reincarnation. So their kind of philosophy is a little more free-flowing, and they basically, whatever I don't get done today, maybe I'll get done tomorrow. Maybe if I don't make it happen in this life, I have the next life. He says, but the Western philosophy, even as early back as the Greeks, is always recognized that we have this life, and we need to get it done in this life. And I think oftentimes we as Christians, sometimes we think that time, sometimes we fall into that kind of that Eastern philosophy that, well, I've got tomorrow. If I don't get it done today, I'll get it done tomorrow. But yet, do we really have a guarantee of tomorrow? We do not. So we have, the guarantee that we have is now, today, to become active and doing something for God. We have now. But we need to recognize that the choices that we make today actually will shape our future. And I think that's one thing that God gives us, the fact that we as humans, that unlike other animals, a honeybee that makes honey, that's what they do. They don't think about it. They make honey. Or a silkworm, it makes silk because that's what it does. But with God, He gives us choices to make a different future depending on the choices that I make today. So as humans, we make futures depending on what we decide to do. And in our lives of being active for God, I think we need to think about making the choices that we can be in the future that God desires us to be in, because we have only now. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, what future are we creating? And I think, unfortunately, as I mentioned, sometimes I know myself that oftentimes we find ourselves kind of living in the past. And I thought about this morning, but I didn't bring it. Thought about bringing my high school letter jacket. Yes, of course, somebody said, well, Mike, you still have a letter jacket. Yes, I do. It's hanging in my closet. And I can remember as a kid it seems like letter jackets aren't as big of a deal anymore. But I remember when I was in high school, if you had a letter jacket, you were the big guy, You were a tough guy. And I remember a lot of the guys, what they would do is if you had any kind of medals from whatever, they would put them on their letter jackets. And you can just remember some guys walking around, it was like they were like a general. They just had a chest full of different medals and stuff. And as they would walk, it would clink, 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 clink. You would think, that is so awesome. So, and I had a few because I did wrestling and stuff. But if we spend our whole life thinking about what we did in the past, what good is that going to do us? And it's kind of funny, Jeb, you don't know this, but this morning in his class, he actually mentioned something that I was thinking about. A very, a very classic movie. I don't watch a lot of movies, but this one, of course, I'm being facetious when I say classic. But any of you saw, I think 10 years ago, the movie called Napoleon Dynamite. Anybody see that? Yeah, it's a classic movie, right? Everybody says, are you kidding me? But one part of the movie that I found interesting is if you Napoleon Dynamite, he was the main character, and something happened to his mother. Anyway, they had to call in his uncle to take care of him while mom was out at the hospital. And I think the uncle was Uncle Rico. Now, the thing I like about this character, what was interesting, is if you remember, he kept making these films of himself. What was he doing? Playing football. He'd make films going back and throwing the football, and he kept telling everybody, he said, I'm telling you, if the coach just would have put me, and not this guy, he's probably in his 30s, he's still thinking about high school. If the coach would have put me in that game in the fourth quarter, we'd have been state champs, and I'd have gone on to pros. And he was still thinking about this 15, 20 years later. He was living his present life in the past. And I think we can do that sometimes, that we can become locked into the past and allow the past to haunt us, to prevent us from going into the future and the activities that God would have us to go to. And oftentimes the problem of living in our past may make us die to the future that God has for us in our lives. It leaves in us a void of inactivity as we become stuck in about how things used to be or could have been. But yet think about Abraham, that he could have become stuck in the past of living in his comfortable life in Haran as he had his family, his friends, his cattle, his life, his business there in Haran, but yet he stepped out because God was calling him into a new future and to do something new for him. So I think in our lives we need to be careful that if we are not careful, that our future could be an extension of our past. That we need to allow God to do something new in our lives and not simply allow that past to haunt us in that way. And I think in the end, sometimes wouldn't we like to think that as I try to live my life for some kind of purpose, wouldn't it be nice at the end of our lives that when we see God or we're before God, wouldn't you rather God ask you, why did you try to do so much rather than why did you settle for so little? So I think in our lives that we need to be asking ourselves, not settling for the little, but doing the much. And so I think is that we need to realize that God is willing to take us as ordinary people and to do extraordinary things, that we're able to do those extraordinary things through him as we put our trust in him. So a book I was reading recently talked about two brothers. And the two brothers, they had a trophy case at home. And the one brother, his trophy case was filled with all the first place trophies. And the other brother that he's actually writing the book says, I was the brother that had the participant trophy, you know. My older brother, he had all the first place trophies. And he said they had a fire in the house, and eventually the fire burned the trophies. And remember, they went home, and their mom was there, and the two brothers were there. She kept saying, don't worry, boys. She goes, I can fix this. I can, there's something I can do. And, of course, the one brother said his were all the participation trophies. He said, well, I'm not really worried about it. And he would expect it. His brother had all the first place trophies. To go, yeah, Mom, fix them. But he goes, no, Mom, just throw them away. He says, I don't want my whole life to be thought about what I accomplished in the past. I want to, he had already created an atmosphere in his life of doing and accomplishing and working for doing things that were more valuable in his life. And I think so in our lives too, is that we need to not become focused on the goal, the things that we've done in the past, but yet to accomplish things for God. So I think in choosing to follow Jesus, we need to be active in our faith and creating a future that at the end of this life, that we can have at the end of this life, that we don't have regrets about what we could have done, that we'll use the opportunities that God puts before us to create the type of life that we want to, that we will feel good about, and that God will feel good about. Oftentimes we chase happiness for things that often in the long run have so little value. But in serving and in being active for God, really that creates joy in our lives. And if anyone has ever said that following Jesus, that's going to automatically solve all our problems, that you're not going to have problems anymore once you choose to follow Jesus, well, that's not true. Because even Jesus said, in this life you will have troubles. He says, fear not, I have overcome. But yet following Jesus does come at a cost. So I think there is a difference between living a life of purpose and one of chasing the fleeting. There is really no comparison. So we need to live a life that when it comes to the end, whenever that means, that we feel like that we have done what we can done and lived a purposeful life, a life full of action and activity. And when we, as James talked about, those trials and troubles and difficulties come into our life, we recognize that, that is how God is shaping us and developing us and improving us by giving us those challenges in our lives. And really we need those challenges in order to create the kind of person that God would have us. And I see our time together is about over. I appreciate your listening to me. The good news and the bad news. I guess the bad news is you had to listen to me this morning. The good news is Jeb, Lord willing, will be back with you next week. So as we conclude these things, I just think about some of the things that we talked about this morning, that hopefully it'll be an encouragement to you in whatever way that God is leading or directing you to take part, to be a participant in God's work and his activity in your life, whatever that may be. There's many, many ways that we can serve here and other ways, so I'd encourage you to do that. And if you've had some kind of things in the past that you think, well, that's been bothering me, we'll just recognize that God, with God, that we can overcome whatever things in the past, and that we can move on to a new life beginning today. So if you're not a Christian, it's a good time to start that new life. But recognize that it does not come with zero cost. There is cost to following Christ. But yet understand that those costs are what we gain is much greater than any other thing that we can benefit from in this life. So if you haven't become a Christian, the time is now. Now you can make that decision, that you can be baptized this morning. That baptism certainly symbolizes the death, the burial, and the resurrection that Jesus did. It also, the Bible talks about symbolizing the waters that Moses went through to save the people of Israel. And it's the same symbolism for us that as we enter to those waters of baptism, we're dying to the past and being raised in a new life, to a new future, to new activities with God. So this morning, I thank you again for being with us this morning. Thank you for giving me a chance to drone on to you here for the last half hour. And if you have any needs, please let us know as we stand and sing the closing song. Thank you.